the Pod Network Entertainment. This episode may cover sensitive topics like sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, depression, and suicide, which could be triggering. While we recognize the challenges this content may pose, we advise you to prioritize your safety and well-being.
Shocking, sad, revealing, and deeply researched, PH Murder Stories podcast covers the true account of infamous killings and true crime stories from the Philippines.
There's no such thing as questions, just hidden answers. Stay tuned as we revisit the inconceivable crimes that exist.
Some listeners may find the following content of PH Murder Stories highly disturbing due to its graphic nature. PH Murder Stories does not condone nor promote violence of all sorts.
Viewer discretion is advised. We've seen that one iconic scene in horror movies before. The protagonist, either being chased or needing to hide, goes under their bed, trying their best to stay quiet as the killer roams around. Some survive, but some end up getting dragged away from under the bed to their death.
Fortunately for a Filipina nurse named Corazon Amurao, almost the exact scene happened to her in real life in 1966. She survived Chicago's most infamous mass murderer, Richard Speck.
You are listening to the PH Murder Stories podcast, and this is our first episode for Season 4. Before we proceed, we would like to thank you guys for your continuous support of our show. We wouldn't have reached this far without you guys. Many thanks to our producers from Podcast Network Asia, and now to our new home, the Podcast Network. Doing what we love is made easier when you're around. Thank you so much for consistently putting our show on the map.
Every reaction and share you make to our social media posts and the 5-star rating you give us on Spotify is much deeply appreciated. But if you're feeling generous, we have posted our GCash QR code and mobile number in our pinned posts on Instagram and Facebook. Any amount you donate will tremendously support our team. Once you do, please make sure to indicate your name or leave a message so we can give you a shout out in our future episodes.
On July 14, 1966, 3 Filipino nurses and 6 other American nurses were victimized by a mass murder. 8 women were gruesomely raped and murdered, and 1 woman survived. The 9 nurses trained in the South Chicago Community Hospital. They all lived in a nearby townhouse dormitory where the massacre took place. Corazon Amurao, a 23-year-old nursing student from the Philippines, was the sole survivor of one of the most gruesome massacres in the United States. Just before 6 a.m., after the gruesome killings, residents of the South Chicago neighborhood heard the sound of a young woman's screams. Corazon was heard shouting, "They're all dead! Help! Help! My friends are all dead! I'm the only one alive!"
The brutal crime started at around 11 p.m. on July 13. As stated by Corazon, the lone survivor, she was asleep in their locked bedroom that she shared with her 2 fellow Filipina nurses, 21-year-old Merlita Gargullo and 23-year-old Valentina Pasion. Corazon heard a knock on their door. When she opened it, a tall man dressed in black, his face pockmarked with acne scars, was pointing a gun at her. He rounded up 2 other Filipino nurses and 3 American-born students in different rooms, 20-year-old Pamela Wilkening and Pat Matusek, and 24-year-old Nina Jo Schmale. Amid the ongoing commotion, the 3 Filipinas somehow managed to break away and hide in a closet. Moments later, the Filipino nurses heard one of their colleagues' voices. They were being urged to come out as the suspect maintained that he would not harm any of them and only wanted to get cash for his upcoming New Orleans trip.
When the 3 Filipino nurses emerged from the closet, They saw the suspect and the American nurses sitting in a circle on the floor. He was holding a gun on them. The other group of nurses, 22-year-old Gloria Davy, 20-year-old Marianne Jordan, and 21-year-old Suzanne Farris, walked in on the hostage scene and immediately became part of it. The women thought that the perpetrator would take their money and leave until he pulled out a knife and started ripping bed sheets into strips. He used those strips to bind hands and feet and gag his captives. After being bound, Corazon rolled under a bed and listened to the horrific ordeal. One by one, 7 of her companions were taken into another room, brutalized, and killed. She remained silent as the killer raped and murdered his last victim, Gloria Davy, in the same room where she was hiding. About 4.5 hours after the ordeal started, he walked out the door and disappeared. Miraculously, the suspect overlooked Corazon. A couple of hours later, she freed herself and ran away from the house to seek help.
According to Corazon, she survived because of luck, and at around 5'2" and less than 100 pounds, she was able to hide under a bed as the killer tortured, raped, stabbed, and strangled her friends. In a detailed report to the investigators, Corazon described the suspect in a precise manner. She also mentioned she saw the suspect's tattoo located on his left forearm, which depicted the words, quote, "Born to raise hell," unquote. Based on Corazon's statement, the authorities managed to connect the crime to a merchant seaman who had been hanging around the neighborhood where the vicious killings took place. The Chicago cops also found fingerprints at the crime scene. They managed to identify Richard Speck, a 24-year-old hot-tempered troublemaker with a history of petty crimes, drinking, drugs, rape, and other violence stretching back to childhood. Despite a massive search conducted by the Chicago authorities, Richard was at large for a few days until he was found on July 17, 1966.
Police were called to a Skid Row flophouse to bring a tall young man to the hospital. He had tried to kill himself, slashing his arms with a knife. Trauma ward doctor Leroy Smith took one look at his new patient and thought this might be the fugitive. All doubt vanished when Dr. Smith washed the blood from the man's arm and saw his tattoo showing what Corazon initially described to the cops. He asked the man, "Are you the man the police are looking for?" And the man responded, "Yes, I'm Richard Speck."
On July 18, Corazon Amurao was scheduled to identify the person who killed her fellow nurses. He was being held at the Bridewell Cermak Memorial Hospital. However, the suspect was not well enough. It led to another scheduled visit the following day, which Corazon had finally identified Richard Speck as the perpetrator.
Richard Speck did not confess, but neither did he assert an alibi. Instead, he professed to have had too much to drink, to have injected himself with drugs, and as a result claimed to have no memory of the events of the dormitory, the nurses, or raping and murdering them. But even without his confession, based on the eyewitness testimony of Corazon and his fingerprints in the townhouse, he was indicted on 8 counts of murder. Despite almost having a slam-dunk case, Chicago prosecutors were worried about Corazon and the media. National magazines were pursuing her for her story, offering compensation. Suppose she told her story to the media before the trial. In that case, prosecutors feared that there might be no community in America where 12 impartial jurors could be found. To protect Corazon, the primary witness from the media, prosecutors hid her from the public, first in hotels and finally in an apartment in downtown Chicago. Corazon and her visiting family lived for the next 7 months under assumed names and 24-hour police protection.
On April 15, 1967, a jury took just 49 minutes to find Richard Speck guilty of the gruesome crime and recommend the electric chair. Corazon Amurao was the state's key witness. Her testimony led the jury to their decision. However, Richard Speck's death sentence became 400 to 1,200 years in prison in 1972 after the U.S. Supreme Court declared capital punishment unconstitutional. He lasted less than 20 years in jail after dying of a heart attack a day before his birthday in 1991. However, Richard Speck's years of incarceration were controversial. The Illinois penal system was said to have been inconsistent and corrupt, and it was documented that Richard Speck lived a life behind bars filled with intoxication and sex. He paraded in women's clothing, his former trim figure bloated by prison weight and with enlarged breasts resulting from illicitly obtained hormones. A video secretly shot at Stateville Prison in 1988 shows the prisoners cavorting with drugs and money, and in the middle of it, Richard Speck performing oral sex on another prisoner. From behind the camera, a prisoner asks Speck why he killed the nurses. Speck shrugs and says, quote, "It just wasn't their night," unquote. When asked how he felt, Speck said, quote, "If you were asking if I felt sorry, no," unquote.
In a memorial mass celebrated by Chicago Archbishop Cardinal Cody for the nurses, the victims' relatives filled the Holy Name Cathedral. Although no relatives of the two Filipino nurses were present, their remains were soon flown to Manila, where hundreds of relatives and friends awaited. In 2016, 50 years after the massacre happened, William J. Martin, the former assistant state's attorney who was the lead prosecutor in the case, said that he reaches out to Corazon from time to time. He had nothing but great words for Corazon's bravery during the time of the crimes. He said, quote, "What she did that night, very few human beings would have the courage to do. She had the guts to move under the bed, which saved her life," unquote. Thank you for listening to PH Murder Stories.
If you like this episode, give us a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
You can also support our show on Patreon. Any amount you donate would benefit our team to keep doing what we love, which is to provide more true crime episodes for our listeners. Link in the description.
For further updates from our show, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at PH Murder Stories. And subscribe to our YouTube channel at PH Murder Stories.
The opinions of podcast creators, hosts, and guests are not necessarily reflective of the official stance of the Pod Network Entertainment, its hosts, or other network programs. The content created by the people behind the podcast is personal and not meant to harm any religion, ethnicity, group, organization, company, or individual.